Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Open Badges MOOC. On behalf of my co-hosts, Erin Knight and Deb Everhart, my name is Ann Derryberry, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's session. Before we get started, I want to just make a couple of announcements. The first is that we are still accepting and grading challenge assignments. And for those of you who haven't done any of that work, you might find during today's session that that's something that could be a very useful activity for you. So want to make sure that you're aware that all of that content is still available to you, and we will respond as you submit your assignment entries. The other announcement that I want to make is that on December 8th, we will have our last MOOC session for this calendar year, not the last MOOC session, but for this calendar year. And as we are reaching the end of the calendar year, we thought it would be a useful time to take a look back at all of the things that have been accomplished for Open Badges in 2014, and also to kind of give us a preview of what we might expect in the year to come, and give you some ideas about how you might further plug into the Open Badges community as you continue to move ahead with the work that you're doing at your institutions or within your part of the ecosystem within your domain. So I hope that you'll mark your calendar for December 8th and join us then as well. Today, we're going to be talking about policy issues as they affect Open Badges, and we'll be joined in a few minutes by Mary Alice McCarthy, who is a Senior Policy Analyst at New America Foundation. But before that, let me kick things off. Those of you who have been with us since we started this MOOC community will remember that our early sessions, we were focused on the ecosystem that surrounds Open Badges and all of the interrelated parts within that ecosystem. To ensure that the ecosystem remains healthy, policies are often enacted that guide the activities and interactions of the various players. Those policies can be at many levels. They can apply to different actors in the ecosystem in different ways. So today we want to take a look at policies that relate to post-secondary education institutions in their many flavors, whether those be universities or community colleges or career and technical education institutions. We're going to look at that whole category. And then after that, we're going to discuss policy at the we're going to discuss policy at the institutional level and at the federal level. I should note at the outset that the federal policy discussion pertains specifically to U.S. policy, but the issues that Mary Alice are going to be addressing may have applicability to other countries as well. We'd love to hear from those outside the U.S. about the policy discussions that are going on in your countries as well, to greater inform all of our understanding of the global ecosystem that is developing around Open Badges. So first, let's begin by discussing policy at the institutional level. What I'm going to be talking about here today is a framework for your thinking. It's not a formula for developing a policy statement, but I want to give you some ideas to think about and some questions to ask yourselves regarding how a policy addressing Open Badges might be approached. The purpose of institutional policy is, in general, to offer principles that will guide decisions and help institutions achieve rational outcomes. In general, they're operational policies. This means that this policy statements aren't necessarily a law or set of laws. And while the policy is generally a statement of intent, I should quickly remind us that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same as what practice will become within the institution that offers up a policy statement. So in some ways, these institutional policies can be viewed as being aspirational. But when they're written, frequently there are protocols that are associated with the aspirational statements, and indeed those protocols can be, for some institutions, become detailed enough so that they look like procedural statements in some ways. There are a lot of ways that institutions put policies together, and I wanted to just kind of give some ideas here of the different kinds of policy statements that post-secondary institutions put together. Certainly pedagogy and the associated technologies that support different pedagogical approaches are matters of policy and often get written up in policy statements. That's especially true as pedagogical approaches change. We're seeing that a lot in for institutions that are moving towards competency-based education, which is a topic we've talked about in some detail in past months. Assessment practices are also changing as different pedagogical approaches are enacted within an institution, and so those often get memorialized in some ways in institutional policy statements. Issues of student intellectual property might be a policy statement that gets written up. Admissions criteria, all the issues related to faculty and how faculty work is done, what the relationship between full-time faculty is to part-time faculty, how advancement and retention occurs. These are all things that can be memorialized in institutional policies. And as you kind of think through each of those topics, it might occur to you that badges could touch each of those areas. So one of the questions we might ask ourselves is whether separate policies need to be put together that talk about open badges or badges within institutions, or should those discussions about how badges are going to be used for a particular institution be embedded into the existing policies? These are questions that each institution needs to address for itself. Which brings up the question, is a policy statement for open badges really necessary? Well, that depends on the institution. It depends on the type of institution, what kind of provider that institution is, what the culture within that institution is. It depends on whether that institution is in fact making a long-term commitment at a particular juncture, or whether things are still in the experimental phases. It's important to think about what the institutional mission is and how open badges fit within that institutional mission. If there are concerns about whether the programs involving badges are going to maintain consistency and be sustainable over time, that could drive an institution toward developing policy statements that cover open badges. And then when you think about whether what kinds of approval cycles, both on an internal basis and externally, how the institution relates to accrediting agencies and may or may not involve discussions of open badges with those agencies. Each of those questions may lead an institution to say, yes, a policy statement is really important to us, or may lead the institution to say, you know, it's not really necessary for us, at least at this time, to have an official policy statement prepared relating to open badges. One of the other questions to ask is really who would care about the open badges policy statement were it in existence. And the audience for a policy statement can be very broad. It could address the interests and concerns of trustees of the institution, of the administrators at every level, whether we're talking about, you know, presidents, chancellors, provost level, or academic deans, or even staff who are in roles that are in student services and other areas that are not academically specific. Each of these kinds of people may have an interest in a policy and use that policy to guide their work. Students are certainly affected by open badges within an institution, and to kind of answer all of their questions, it may be useful to put out policies for them, to guide researchers in their work, to talk to, as I mentioned before, accreditors, and even to advise legislators and to bring funders and donors into the conversation about what the institution intends when open badges are implemented. All of these kinds of people have an interest in where the institution stands and may be best informed by a formal policy statement being in place. So I've touched on some of the questions that come up about where policy touches the different players within an ecosystem, and there are a number of different kinds of topics that a policy statement might involve. Again, this is highly dependent upon the institution and what the nature of the program is, or the implementation is that's being put forward. I said at the beginning that for those of you who haven't yet gotten into the challenge assignments, that you might find that that's a useful activity to go through. Those of you who have done it have already begun to think about many of the questions that a policy statement might address. And so I would recommend that if you haven't yet begun to think through some of the questions that are raised through those challenge assignments, that might be a helpful tool and helpful set of activities to go through. But as this list on the slide demonstrates, there are lots of different things that an institutional policy statement may want to include. Certainly the new terms and special terms that open badges bring to the academic conversation would be worth putting forward so that everybody's on the same page. Issues of design, how is assessment going to be affected, what sort of research questions do we want to put forward, what kind of metrics do we want to trap, how are we going to ensure the privacy of all of the people who are receiving, issuing, designing badges, are there ethical considerations, and how are we going to inform the greater community? These are all the kinds of topics that you might want to include in a policy statement. And I want to actually address in deeper detail some of these topics and bring forward, highlight some of the questions that you might want to think about in greater depth here. So of course you want to talk about what the types and purposes of the badges are that you are contemplating rolling out as you put forward your badge initiative. So what I mean by that is there are lots of different ways, as we've talked about, that you might be thinking of using badges within your institution, and it's a good idea if you're going to go as far as putting a policy statement together to really define what those are, define the intent, define what your intended outcomes are. Do you want your badges to be strictly to address things that are within the curriculum, or do you want things that your badges to strictly address things that are outside the formal curriculum? Are you looking at some sort of hybrid kind of application? We've talked about the difference between skills-based badges, competency-based badges, and participation badges. Some institutions find that it's helpful to embrace all of those things. So you might want your policy statement to call all of that out and define those for everybody's understanding. One of the things that competency-based education enables us to do, of course, we've talked about this, is to modularize content and modularize outcomes and build smaller levels of achievement and competence that students can gain along the way. Well, will your institution be badging the skills and competencies gained on that sort of incremental basis? It's a good idea to define that if that's the intent. If the intent is to think about badges in a more terminal way, then you would want to state that specifically as well. There's a great deal of interest these days, and some of you are probably engaged in these conversations. There's a great deal of interest in putting badge systems in place in secondary, even earlier educational levels. And if that's the case, then there are students who are already beginning to collect badges that may have value for admissions officers. Well, if yours is an institution who might be open to accepting badges in the admissions process, that's something that you'll want to define not only for yourselves but for the students who would be bringing those kinds of things forward. That's something that you might also want to include in your policy statements. The notion that we talked about just a second ago about modularizing content is a very interesting one and opens up all kinds of other conversations as well. When we talk about open badges, of course, we want things to be as transparent and visible to all people, all parties concerned as possible. So perhaps that's something that ought to go in a policy statement. What are the ways that students are going to be able to see the learning pathways that are available to them? What are the ways that they're going to be able to see alternatives for themselves that could run in parallel or instead of each other? All of this would be something that should be made explicit, and an institutional policy statement can be a good place to lay all of that out, at least in terms of the guidelines for how an institution intends to implement these sorts of things. And this is, when articulated formally for all to see, this can really facilitate relationships with employers and make explicit what those connections are between what's offered at the institution and what the employer can look to from the institution because of the open badge implementations that institution is doing. Assessment is, of course, a key area, as we've said many times. Actually, badges are tied to assessment more than they're tied to learning per se. And so what does this mean for the institution in terms of where assessment happens? Who performs the assessments? Who designs the assessments? Do the people who conduct assessment, are they the same folks who actually issue badges? Well, that's something that you want to make very explicit. What kinds of assessment methodologies will be put in place when open badges are introduced into the conversation? And how do those attach to the relationship that the institution has with regional and local employers? Again, all things that should be made explicit and clear to all parties concerned. Transcripting and publishing is a sort of, well, the transcripting part is sort of a future thinking notion. What is the institution's policy going to be when around grades and badges. Will they exist side by side? Will they be will badges ultimately be used instead of the traditional grading systems? And if so, what's that transitional period going to look like, and what are the operational implications of all of that? All of that ought to be made explicit and available for all to know and understand. And how about the students who earn the badges? What are the options that they'll have available to them to display their badges? Will they be in an e-portfolio system that they also attach work product to? Will they only be available for to publish in social media? Will you restrict what the options are for your students in terms of where they can carry their badges to and what kinds of publishing and display of those badges you will facilitate for them? Again, good idea to make that explicit and available information for all. When badges are created, what is the design that those badges are going to use? Everything from the details about color and fonts and what the shape of badges is going to be for your institution. That relates to the rest of institutional branding, and how are you going to align badges with the way branding happens for the institution in other contexts. Will there be a uniform naming scheme that you adopt for your institution related to badges? Who will govern that? How will approvals happen related to the naming schemes that are adopted for badges within your institution? And what if there are multiple levels? What if you can level up your badges? If you have modularized content that builds on it in the form of stackable credentials, what are the guidelines that you want to put forward around how all of that occurs? Each of these is an important question, even though they seem like minor points initially as you begin to think about the overarching badge systems that you will be putting in place. All of these are questions that will need to be answered. Finally, in terms of the kinds of examples or of questions that I would submit you want to ask yourselves, intellectual property is a very, very significant one. It's a very thorny issue for post-secondary institutions in many ways. And when we think about who owns course material, who owns the intellectual property related to all of the work that faculty do, how does that extend to the badges that will be developed for your institution? Who actually will be creating those badges? Will it be the faculty themselves, the instructors themselves, or will this come from the Office of Teaching and Learning and the support staff there who are so key to so many of these new programs that institutions develop? Regardless of who actually has the responsibility for the creation of badge systems, who owns that intellectual property? Is it owned by the institution overall? Is it owned by the department where the badge system is being developed? How about maybe it's the faculty who would have ownership? These are big questions that are going to be really important to sort out and make explicit and open and available for all. And what about the earners? They're the ones who have, the students are the ones who actually have gained new skills, gained new competencies, gained new knowledge that they are using the badges that they've earned to communicate out to the world what their achievements and accomplishments have been. Do they own their own badges, or do they own, or are they still the property of the institution? Thorny questions. They seem perhaps apparent answers up front, but not necessarily when you really start digging deep inside those questions. And finally, what are the relationships your institution has with other institutions, other learning institutions? Will you share badges? Will you allow other institutions to make use of the badges that are created within your institution? Will your institution accept badges, award badges that come from other institutions? And what procedures for approval need to be put in place? What kinds of relationships need to be put in place? Again, all of that should be clearly articulated and openly available for all the constituents to have at the ready and understand what the institutional policy is. So these are just some of the very, very many questions, but as you begin to put your programs into place, we thought it would be helpful for you to begin to have some of these questions in your mind, so that your institution is prepared to move forward and kind of avoid some of the pitfalls that you can rapidly fall into if a lot of these questions haven't been asked up front. These thoughts, these topics, these questions that I'm putting forward before you right now actually come out of a working group that the Badge Alliance has put together, and out of that working group came a document, a framework document that goes into far greater detail than we've had time to go into today, and I've provided a link here for you so that you can look at this document in greater detail yourself and get into some of the explanations behind these various categories. So there are a lot of categories that I haven't touched on, but this is a quite useful tool for institutions that are moving forward with open badges, and together with the challenge assignment thinking that we put before you a year or so ago. I think that this will really help you, everybody get better prepared for where they're going with all of this. So here's the link for you here, and as you put your institutional policies together, should your institution move in that direction, we would love to know of what that work is. We're looking to gather as many of these institutional policy statements together as we can, both to inform the community and to provide additional models for other people, but also for our own understanding of what institutional needs and discussions are around this point. So please share back with us if you go in this direction. So that's a little bit of a hint about how to think about institutional policy. All of this falls within a much greater context than just the single institution. To take a look at what the bigger picture is, Mary Alice McCarthy has joined us here today. She is Senior Policy Analyst, as I said earlier, with New America Foundation, and she's going to talk a bit about what is going on at the federal level and the policy discussions going on there. Mary Alice.
Thank you, Ann, and thanks to Ann and Deb both for the opportunity to join you all today. Hope my volume's okay. I'm very excited to be a part of this discussion. I'm a big enthusiast when it comes to badges, and in general spend a lot of time thinking and talking about credentialing and how to improve our credentialing systems, both in our higher education system and in our labor market. Just a little background on me before I sort of dive into some just sort of big picture issues or big picture sort of themes to think about in relation to federal policy. I did spend some time working at the U.S. Department of Labor and folks there in the Employment and Training Administration, and did some work there. And you know, this was 5 years ago, and we were talking about credentials then, and generally speaking, we would speak to a lot of pretty empty rooms at conferences, or there'd be a few folks who would show up. And these days now, credentialing is a very hot issue, and people are talking about a lot, and the rooms are full. So it's been a relatively short time that this conversation has ramped up very quickly. After that, I spent some time at the U.S. Department of Education, where also there's tremendous interest in alternative credentialing models, and particularly non-degree credentials, which is right where the badges discussion fits in. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit, not so much specifically about badges, but about federal discussions around education and training policies and how they affect the ways we think about credentialing. And thinking then about when we're talking about policies that affect credentialing, badges are a part of that discussion, and I think hopefully folks who have been working with these digital badges and open badges have a lot to sort of add to the conversation about how to create better quality credentials. And so I'll talk a little bit more about where I see those opportunities. But before that, I wanted to just talk a minute about the context, which is, you know, what's changed? Why was it that just, you know, a few years ago, you know, the mention of the word credentials would put pretty much everybody in the room to sleep, and now it's suddenly of great interest to many people. And obviously a big thing that happened was the recession and a whole lot of people getting thrown out of work and suddenly finding themselves out in the labor market with a lot of skills and a lot of capabilities that they didn't really have any way to communicate to people, or that they didn't have any way to communicate to potential employers. That happened at the same time that the skill requirements and educational requirements have been gradually increasing. And, you know, I'm sure you all are as well aware as I am of the projections around the educational requirements of the jobs of the future, with over 2/3 of jobs requiring some form of post-secondary credential. So the recession sort of taught everybody that, wow, I need a way to really be able to communicate my skills. And I think it really brought out into the open that we don't really have a good way to do that. Our current credentials are sort of a mess, and they don't communicate very well. So in this slide, you see I've got a whole bunch of different currencies, right? And, you know, this is, you know, obviously a metaphor for we have a whole bunch of different types of credentials that, or we have a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about communicating skills. We communicate skills through certain kinds of educational credentials. We communicate skills through certain kinds of labor market credentials. And the two currencies don't really speak to each other very well. And so what we need is more of a single currency that allows these to come together. Because our current credentials are pretty static and pretty mute, really. They don't say very much. They are not deep, they are not stackable, they're not portable, they are not necessarily even competency-based. So I think what the recession brought to everybody's awareness was that we needed a more flexible credentialing system in which credentials actually communicated more specifically what sorts of skills what people could do, and that also could be things that they could sort of build on rather than being sort of one-time credentials that you sort of get your diploma or you get your degree and you move on and you never have to get another one. So I always like the analogy of the karate belts. Everybody knows what a black belt is, and everybody knows that you get a black belt by getting a whole bunch of belts before that. It's stackable, it's portable, it's transparent, and it's not electronic would be the one difference. But I mean, I think it sort of represents the type of credential the type of credential model that we would want to see. And then if you take that and on top of it, you think about how it can speak to both educational institutions and employers and function in the labor market, then that's where we want to be moving to. And excitingly, that's, you know, open badges have a lot of those characteristics. So that's the sort of large sort of framing, I think, for at the federal level, where people would like to see things go. And an understanding that our current models for credentialing are not working very well, and that we need to find ways to do it better. But this does bring us to the question, is just because things aren't working well in terms of our current credentialing policies, what does that mean in terms of the role of federal policy? And I would say first and foremost, it doesn't mean that we want to think about federal policy creating credentials or defining credentials or issuing credentials necessarily. The role of federal policy, when in this kind of area of education and training policy, really is around trying to ensure that these markets function well. The role of federal, you generally don't want any sort of federal policy unless you've got some sort of problem that you're trying to address. As we said, that we've sort of defined the problem as our current credentials, our systems are too fragmented. They don't function well as a currency, and they don't function well as a currency. So if we think about the role of federal policy as being sort of helping markets function better, when we think about federal policy in relation to credentials, a good way to think about it is how do we help labor markets function better, and how do we help credentials be a currency that operates in labor markets that help them function more efficiently. And I think that that's a helpful way to think about how federal policy can be helpful in the same way that federal policy can be helpful in helping other kinds of markets be more efficient and function more effectively. Okay, so I sort of posit that we would really want to see three sort of general principles guiding federal policy making as it affects credentials. Again, I would never want to have, we would never want to see federal policies for credential making, but there are federal policies in the education and training realm that are related to credentials. And what would we like to see that federal policy do? And I would say we want to see it do three things. We want to see it drive the development and adoption of high-quality credentials, and those high-quality credentials have the characteristics that we talked about earlier, being transparent, stackable, portable, and competency-based, as well as, to the degree possible, deep. And then we also want federal policy to ensure equity. We want to make sure that everyone has access to these high-quality credentials. And then we also want to make sure that federal policy protects consumers and taxpayers from fraudulent providers of credentials, from providers of very low quality credentials, and also protects consumers in terms of their privacy. And I know privacy is obviously going to be a big issue. It already is a big issue in education and training policy, and the whole badges movement certainly raises lots of issues around privacy as well. So given these three sort of guiding principles, these are the three things we would want federal policy to sort of push for in terms of policies that relate to credentials. What possible avenues are available within federal policies? And I sort of identify four what I call federal policy vehicles, four ways in which we can think about how federal policy can create quality, ensure equity, and protect consumers. And the first is through its research and evaluation activities. The second is through its discretionary investments. The third is through technical assistance and capacity building, which the federal government does do a lot of. And then the fourth is, of course, through legislation. But I think it's important when we're thinking about how federal policy can sort of help create a better credentialing ecosystem or a better credentialing market, to remember it's not just through legislation. There are lots of other important ways that the federal government can be helpful here. So in terms of research and evaluation, again, there is a whole lot of interest in alternative credentials these days, a whole lot of interest in particular in non-degree credentials. And the National Center for Education Statistics is working with the Census Bureau now and has recently launched some of the very first ever public surveys on the prevalence of non-degree credentials. They're looking specifically at certifications and licenses. Future rounds of the survey are also going to look at certificates. But this new, the fact that non-degree credentials are being incorporated into federal education databases and federal education data collection efforts is very important, because it shows that there's a real interest in sort of broadening how we think about credentials, what we collect, it shows a real interest in understanding how credentials help improve earnings, help improve employment, what sectors of the economy they flourish in, what sectors of the economy they don't. So I think for the badges movement and for people thinking about developing badges, it's important to know, to be aware of this research and to potentially look for opportunities to incorporate sort of badges into future federal research and evaluation activities. Similarly, there's a lot of evaluation going on right now of different education and training models, both in the higher education space and also sort of more specifically in CTE programs. But one of the big areas is in competency-based education. And under the Higher Education Act, there is, within the Higher Education Act, there is what is called the Experimental Sites Authority. And the Department of Education then runs a set of experiments to test the effectiveness of certain kinds of educational strategies for increasing acceleration or reducing, generally it's all related to financial student aid programs and whether or not it enables students to finish their programs quicker and otherwise reduces the amount of financial aid that they need. So there's currently two really interesting experimental sites two interesting experiments underway that I think can be very valuable to the badging community. Right now, the department is accepting proposals to do experiments on competency-based education and prior learning assessment. And as Anne already mentioned, competency-based education with its focus on modularized curricula and with assessment-based sort of pathways and proficiency-based advancement really lends itself to a badging approach or to a micro-credentialing approach. So I think this could be a real opportunity to test, how badges can support quality within a competency-based education, how it can be embedded into a degree program, a competency-based degree program. So I would encourage folks to if you just Google competency-based education experimental sites, you'll find it. Similarly, there's an experiment that's just wrapping up that the department's been doing about the effectiveness of short-term training. And here they're looking at whether or not short-term training programs supported through the financial aid system actually enable people to experience good employment earnings outcomes. And I just think the short-term training, depending on what comes out of that experiment, again, it could be very helpful in terms of what are the credentials associated with short-term training. If it does show that these are effective programs in terms of employment and earnings, again, I think there's a way to think about them. What are the right kinds of credentials to build around those short-term training programs, and how can those credentials in turn be stackable and portable, et cetera. And so again, it's another opportunity for some alternative credentialing to really build quality within higher education programs. And finally, then we have both the Higher Education Act, but also the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and the Crowley-Perkins Act all run pilots and demos. They are always looking for ways to sort of test new approaches, and I do think, it's just always something to keep your eye out on for opportunities you might see to, again, test the effectiveness of badges for helping people, navigate sort of the transition from school to work. Okay. So in addition to research and evaluation the federal government has a number of discretionary investments, has done some, is on the verge of doing others, that also I think have really interesting implications for furthering the discussion around non-degree credentials and what quality credentials look like that I think the badges movement, again, could have an important voice in. The Department of Energy, for example, developed, this is a fairly unusual way for the federal government to get involved, but with the Green Energy Act, the Department of Energy worked with some industry associations and some community colleges and actually developed credentials. And if you're interested in sort of looking at what they thought about as they really sort of tackled the issue within these new and emerging industries, what does it mean to create a quality credential, a skills-based credential, a competency-based credential in this area? and make it work on both the labor market side and within the educational institutions. There's just some really interesting work that's been done there that I think meshes really nicely with a lot of the thinking and that I've heard in the Open Badge movement. And these are very much that's very much an emerging field, so it might be an exciting area to think about badges. And the Department of Labor has a number of discretionary investments that, again, are sort of trying to tackle this credentialing issue. I would say the Department of Labor, more than any other federal department, is really trying to figure out how to create an effective how to improve sort of the labor market and the ability of people to navigate the labor market through better credentials. Their Trade Act Assistance grants, they're called TACT. They've just issued the last round of these grants, but they have focused very much on helping institutions build stackable credentials. I know a lot of community colleges have sort of experimented with badging through the TACT investments, and I think we're going to hopefully see some more exciting work in that area. But I think it's done a lot to raise awareness about the need to connect workforce and academic credentials, and to, again, create these kinds of stackable credentials. And then we're all waiting. I mean, any day now, the Department of Labor is going to announce this $100 million worth of grants to go to the development of apprenticeship programs. And again, apprenticeship programs are an interesting example of people gaining skills through work, at the workplace. The registered apprenticeship programs, registered apprentices who participate in registered apprenticeship programs earn certificates when they participate in apprenticeship programs, helping the department think through how those certificates how to build quality within those certificates, how to think about making them digital, making them transparent, making them competency-based, can sort of build value within those certificates is something that I think could be very valuable. So look for that opportunity when it comes out. It's due to be announced any day now if it hasn't already, and I just missed it. So. And then finally, the Department of Education is also very much interested in this space, and I would say a lot of the credentialing discussion, or a lot of the interesting credentialing is, as Anne said, very much married with the interesting competency-based education models. They sort of go together very nicely. The department has these big first-in-the-world investments. The first-in-the-world program is investing in a lot of new approaches to assessment and to modularized and competency-based curricula. And I do think, again, institutions are interested in trying to find ways to credential those modules in ways that also fit with degree programs. And so I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities there, particularly the relationship between assessments and credentials and making it more transparent. And then finally, we get to the big elephant in the room, which is technical assistance. Just quickly, the federal government does issue quite a bit of non-regulatory sort of technical assistance in the form of guidance letters, and it has websites. I would just say, if you're looking for information about competency models and how the Department of Labor in particular thinks about credentialing and competencies, I would encourage you to check out their websites, in particular Career One Stop. Check out some of their guidance on that Training and Employment Guidance Letter 1510 is specifically on credentials. There is a mention of badges in it. It'll just give you a little bit of a look into how the federal government thinks about credentialing and where it sees badges sort of fitting into that world. And also a chance to think about how to sort of connect with some of the work that the department is doing with industry associations around building competency models, and how to connect with employers to think about badging those competencies, which I think lots of employers are very, very interested in. Okay, so finally then we get to legislation. I'm going to hurry here because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. I just listed some of the major pieces of legislation that I think intersect with credentials in some way. They either fund individuals to get credentials, or they fund institutions that issue credentials. They all, there's lots of opportunities in general to sort of help policymakers who, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, to think about how badges fit into their particular areas of legislation. Some of the big obvious ones, of course, are the Higher Education Act, WIOA, the Carl D. Perkins Act, TANF, which is probably not one that people think about a lot, but I think there's lots of really interesting opportunities for open badges within TANF. Often low-income adults really don't have credentials, particularly those lacking a GED, and finding ways for folks to have some sort of meaningful credential to take into the labor market could be really valuable to folks who are trying to make that transition. And then, of course, also all of the Department of Defense and Veterans investments in educational benefit programs and the need for veterans for good credentials. So I could talk for a long time about each one of these pieces of legislation that would be way down in the weeds and would probably get really boring. So I'm just going to spend a minute to talk about the Higher Education Act, since it is the really big piece of legislation. That's a $150 billion program that funds, it's $150 billion of taxpayer dollars that help people get credentials. And it's coming up for reauthorization. So we're in a really historic time with HEA, and I think this HEA conversation is coming at a good time, having just had the experience of the recession and sort of seeing how much we need to rethink the relationship between our post-secondary educational system and the labor market, and how much we need to build better pathways or bridges between these two worlds is good. So, you know, we can sort of look at the silver lining that way. And I think the badges movement can be a really helpful part of that discussion. One of the big areas where I think we need to spend a lot of time in talking about with regard to HEA reauthorization is in the quality assurance system, particularly the quality assurance of certificates, which are non-degree credentials. I'd be happy if anybody wants to follow up to talk more about how higher ed, but I think I'm talking to an audience of lots of higher ed people, so you all know this already, but the ways in which the accrediting community ensures quality of credentials, but particularly certificates, is very opaque. There are not models or clear criteria for evaluating the quality of a certificate program. I think it's time, given the tremendous popularity of certificate programs, I think it's time that the accrediting community begins to think about how they're going to ensure quality and thereby protect consumers and taxpayers of certificates. And I think that the open badges movement can be a real help to them in thinking about what they should be looking for in terms of the quality characteristics of certificates. I also think that within a big opportunity with the reauthorization of HEA is to secure more support for competency-based education approaches to make it easier to do competency-based education. And again, I think to the degree that we know that we can effectively assess and credential education below the degree level effectively, I think that opens up more space to think about competency-based approaches. So I do see that as a real opportunity space for folks who are interested in alternative credentialing models. And then finally, just in general with HEA, I'm certainly hoping that the conversation focuses on doing a much better job paying attention to student outcomes as a way of driving quality within higher education. When we focus on student outcomes, that means we're focusing on what happens to them after they leave the institution in terms of their employment and earnings. If that's what you're being held more responsible for, you're going to care a whole lot more about whether or not the credentials that your students are earning actually have labor market value, and that in turn is going to make you think a whole lot more about what a quality credential looks like. So again, I think this is a great place for badges, for the badges movement, to think about how to be a part of that outcomes discussion, because it's going to be a very tense discussion. But how can things like open badges help with transitions into the labor market that and help institutions of higher education equip students with credentials that lead to better outcomes when they leave the institution. Okay, so I think that this last point, a couple of closing thoughts, which I'm not sure that I have time for, so I'm just going to say really quick, what are the risks of creating federal policy support for open badges? Again, when I was first asked about doing this presentation, I thought to myself, gosh, federal policy and open badges, I think your first hope should be that there isn't any. The most important thing right now, I think, with the badges movement is to make sure that this really exciting area of innovation continues to grow, and that it not be sort of stifled in any way by policies that try to regulate it too early. It's a really exciting area for innovation, and I think we all have lots to learn. That said, I do think there are some real opportunities within existing legislation and some of the things that are going on to influence the conversation. I think everyone's fear at the federal level with badges is that it's going to just potentially add more confusion to the credentialing ecosystem and create more confusion for both students, job seekers, and employers. And so that's just something to think about. That's what people are worried about here. It's another credential. What's it mean? What's it worth? How do we think about it? More fragmentation. So that's a scary thought. And then I'm just going to close with this last thought, which is, as I said, I've been in the federal government when I was in the federal government, which I'm not anymore. There's growing interest in credentialing. I think the understanding of how technology and how openness and how credentials being digital can really create tremendous value is not something that policymakers always understand. It took me a while to sort of get that sort of light bulb moment of the relationship between technology and better credentials. And so I would just encourage everybody to, first of all, keep in mind that not everybody gets that connection, and that we have some work to do to help policymakers understand how digital credentials really open up a whole new sort of landscape of possibilities for improving the quality of credentials. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to see. So helping people see it would be a great thing. Okay, I think that's it for me. Yes. Oh, and that's my happy railroad tracks that all connect with one another in our when credentials really do function the way they're supposed to. Okay. So Deb, I think, or Anne, who am I handing it back to?
Well, there are some questions from the chat, and this is Deb. I'll start with a couple of questions that are probably questions for both of you. So one is, does it help reassure stakeholders when open badges are framed in policy? Is it possible, and I think you both already touched on this, that we would be looking at death by committee or other things that would actually restrict or harm badge creativity? So what are your comments on that balance between that value to stakeholders and potential encumbrances?
When Mary Alice, this is Anne, when Mary Alice and I first started talking about what we wanted to say in this presentation today, one of the things that we were talking about was, policy is often responsive. It's not proscriptive. It's not necessarily what you want to lead with. It's in response to some issue or concern that has cropped up. So a lot of institutions may decide that it is not necessary to lead with some sort of policy statement. On the other hand, it can be helpful if there are just some basic understandings that are laid out up front. And again, I'm speaking from the institutional perspective. If basic understandings are laid out up front so that everybody has a basis from which to start and a common language with which they're working, and some ideas about roles and responsibilities and where to turn if there are questions and that sort of thing. So it's I think something that each institution has to decide for itself. Unfortunately, there isn't a fast and easy answer that covers everybody. Would you agree, Mary Alice, or do you have a different thought about that?
I completely agree, and I think it's a valid concern to worry, that when is the right moment for policymaking, and it's a difficult timing question. I do think thinking about just helping people get on the same page and read from the same playbook before policymaking is certainly the way to go. But and in terms of federal policy, again, I think it's just important to understand that to frame the discussion around badges in this larger discussion around credentials and sort of labor market transitions. So it's not a narrow discussion, but a broad discussion, and I would think the same would be true for institutions.
Okay, I think we are at the top of the hour, and that sounds like a good note to end on. Thank you so much. This was a great presentation, you guys, on an extremely important topic.
Thank you.
Absolutely, and let's keep the conversation going, and then we'll look forward to seeing everybody in December for a retrospective and preview all at the same time.